most guys leave them out for 3 days, but the bait has done its job in the first 12 hours. After that, there's minimal. You will get a certain amount of crabs that, just because they're crabs, even if the bait is no longer effective, they see a dozen crab in somewhere, they think that's something good, I want it too. They're very competitive.
Females generally run a little smaller and are distinguished by their more roundish flap. They're also capable of dispersing up to 2.5 million eggs in one spawn. For this reason, most folks do not keep females, even though it is legal for sport anglers to do so. Crab eat almost anything, so long as it's meat, including other crab. Hanging a fish carcass from the top of the cage will work, but Bob prefers using chopped blocks of sardines, anchovies, or squid in hanging jars. A cooperative ocean really helps when trying to find your floats. It's also a lot easier to get a hook on the float line. Bob explains the reason for 2 floats on one line.
Now, what I always do on these end caps, both ends of the lines are marked with 2 floats. That's the only reason, that's the only thing, only 2 spots are, and it's important because it tells me which way the current is going. Okay, the last thing a boat wants that has a rudder and a strut is to roll over his rope, and you got to send the diver down. And so, you put those end caps on the end, you see which way the current's going, so you protect yourself, okay? And the same thing applies to the single floats that we're going to be picking up. And the floats all have points. Now, don't string them backwards. In other words, string the point first toward the pot, so you always know which way that rope is going underwater.
When a pot comes up suspiciously devoid of crab, it may be more than a bad spot.
The reason why we only had 1 crab in here is this wire came apart here, and they worked on it, and they started coming out here.
You want tie wrap, or you want...
give me a wire, Bobby.
Okay.
That guy was so big he couldn't get out.
Yeah.
It takes a Dungeness crab close to 3 years to reach keeper size. They can live for up to 13 years. Most of the crab caught on this trip are well over the sport minimum size limit of 5 3/4 inches. Be sure to always carry a gauge and keep the crabs alive until they're ready for the pot.
These happen to be made by Bentoncourt, a local 4th generation crabber here on the coast. There's more to building a pot than just throwing a bunch of wire together. Tunnel angle, very important. Dungeness do not like to climb. But why these are effective is, if you can get the right tunnel angle, get them to climb just that much and they drop in, what happens is, the crabs are like these plots remind you of a minnow trap, where the hole that goes into the front, the minnows try to get around the outside. They never have enough sense to go back to the middle. The same thing with Dungeness crab. They work the outside. So what happens is, if you're going to leave your gear out for longer periods of time, I would recommend that you have something that don't leak. Leak is a word that the crabbers use when they get out. And the reason is in order to get a big pot like this that would house a lot of crab and not clog the doors, they used to make them in 28-inch and put 1 tunnel. Well, commercial guys, they have they weigh like 60 to 100 pounds, and as a little sport guys like us, that's just too much for us to deal with. So what I did was I asked that I got the 32 inches that I wanted, and we just started weighing rebarb to get down to that magical 32, 33, 34 pounds. And when we found the right rebarb, then we started tacking them together, and this is what we ended up with: a nice large sport crab pot that was easy for us to work with and fishes really well.
Where are the holes on the outside?
Holes on the outside, Fish and Game requires that you have to have a 4 1/4 inch hole for small crab to get out the corns.
These round pots weigh about 45 pounds, including the lead mounted on the bottom of the cage. This helps them stay on the ocean floor, but they still can walk.
if there's a lot of kelp in the water after a storm, you see these big kelp patties. Well, they get tangled up in the buoys, and that is so buoyant that it'll take it, and it'll actually take this pot, lean it up on its side, and it'll roll. Okay? Now, there's ways around avoiding that kelp situation. It's not foolproof, but if you look at my gear as I run 1 float. A lot of guys run 2 floats. It's easy for them to get it, but I run 1 float because I have less chance of getting tangled up in that kelp, and it goes right through. The other thing is, when stormy weather, bad weather, a lot of current, if you're running 2 floats, you're that much more buoyant, and you have a better chance for it to walk. Whereas the single float, it can storm out here for 2 weeks, and all mine will do is keep sinking. And as soon as the weather clears, I come out and my gear's in the same place I left it.
Just south of the harbor, in 30 to 40 feet of water, is one of Bob's favorite old spots.
I started with these pots many years ago with 6 of them, and as you can see, they flat fish. The downside of this pot, I'll give you the upside and the downside. The downside is the construction is not as solid as the round gear that was on the outside, the bedding courts. You've heard me talk about leakage. Leakage meaning it's a term that the crabbers use for crab when they get out. And as I showed you with the tunnels on the other pots, how they came in, dropped down, and then worked the perimeter where there was no doors, so you got them. And so if you were gonna do a long soak, I would, if you were gonna leave them out for 3-4 days at a time, I would go with the bedding courts. But a lot of sport guys, including myself, we drop these things on the way out to go rock fishing, and they will outfish that bedding court on a 4-hour soak, maybe on a day soak, maybe 2 to 1. And the reason is you've got an entry point on all 4 sides. But if you leave them too long, because they go to the outside to work the perimeter, they get to these doors and they figure it out. We put a bridle on them. The reason we put a bridle on them is because of the poor construction. But the bridle also, when you throw the float first and you drop this overboard, it's sucking the float towards you. So in other words, it keeps it in an up position to help it land flush on the floor. We add 16 pounds of weight that's in here. Now, if you're gonna get out where there's some current, you're gonna get offshore a little bit, you need a little bit of weight. If you're just gonna drop them in 30 feet of water and go 20 feet and go 100 yards away and go rock fishing up here, on a perfect day, you can get away with it. But I would always put about 16 pounds of weight. And then what I do to reinforce them is I put tie wraps here. In other words, so when I go to pull, it just doesn't, pull it all apart. You try to give it as much strength as you can. But and then of course the doors. In the current out there, sometimes it'll push the door open, and that's all you need because these things are already working a perimeter. So we add weights. You can buy weighted doors, but we just get a piece of round lead, cut it like that, slide it over it, and hit it with a hammer.
Instead of dropping the empty pot right back down, Bob and crew will bring up the entire string before dropping back down.
What Donnie's doing back there is something that most guys don't do. Most guys pick up a pot and they throw it right back down. And if you run a 15-pot string, you may have your first half that are caught a couple, but the last half really lit them up. So now you're stuck with half your string in a bad area. What we do is we stack every pot on board, and then we, depending on where the productive areas were in the string, then we move them. And it's a simple process, autopilot, and everything is positioned perfect. The way we stack them so that the rope, you will see, comes right off the top. And when it gets to the end of the rope, the other one automatically the other side goes out. So your spacing is perfect, you're on autopilot, so your line is perfect, and you're back in, the hub of the crab fishery. And, we want to get them.